Welcome back. It's Tim and Julie Harris, and this is your favorite daily real estate coaching and training podcast. Today's topic is why you didn't get the listing, top 10 mistakes to avoid. And what we're going to be doing is focusing on the top 10 reasons why, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, why agents don't get the listing. And it's not always because the other agent overpriced the house or cut their commission. So we're going to go into some of the intricate little detailed things that you might take for granted or maybe didn't even know about or certainly didn't know how important they were. Now, if you want today's notes, which I know you do, make sure you go to harrisrealestatedaily.com and subscribe to our newsletter. The newsletter is free. You can just go to harrisrealestatedaily.com and subscribe to the newsletter directly, or you can scroll down below and click the link in today's show description. Julie?
Yes. All right. Thank you for that. Top 10 mistakes to avoid. This is part one of a two-part podcast series. We're going to do points 1 through 5. And you can certainly turn this into a checklist. You can look at this two ways. Maybe looking back in time why you might not have gotten a listing, being introspective, or maybe more than one listing, and looking forward, how you're going to make a commitment to not fall into any of these mistakes, certainly not a combination of these mistakes would even be worse. And using the newsletter notes, you can literally turn this into a checklist to review before you go on your next listing. So just to keep it nice and practical for everybody. So here's the thing. In real estate, securing listings is the pinnacle of skill, demanding sharp mental labor compared to the physical hustle or physical labor of working with buyers. Yet many agents, and I've even heard brokers say this, I think, Tim, you've heard office managers and brokers say, well, you should expect about a 50-50 chance, 50% success rate on listing appointments. But that standard should be unacceptable to you. If you wouldn't tolerate a 50% grade from your kids, why settle for it in your career? I mean, if you're getting a 50% in grade school, you don't even get to go on to the next grade. Listings are the backbone of a thriving, lucrative real estate business offering financial security, emotional stability, and more free time. Becoming a masterful listing agent is challenging, but it's also essential because failing to hone this skill is a liability, especially in today's buyer world. I read a report this morning, Tim, that was talking about how people looking to list going forward in the next 18 months or so, they stated, this was like a 1,000-person future listing interview that one of the analytics companies did. 23% of them said they were considering selling it on their own. That's the highest FSBO projection that I've ever heard. And they stated different reasons, you know. But the point is, the buyer lifestyle is not as good as the listing lifestyle. And this is why you want to become a masterful listing agent. The top 10 reasons agents walk away from listing appointments empty-handed, we're going to talk about over this next two podcasts. Ready to rumble?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's worth noting that the theme of this week's podcasts were inspired by the coaching call I had last week with our long-term coaching client who comes and goes in our schedules. But the gist of it is that he was losing his listing game and he wasn't as, efficient as he once had been. And he sort of lost his way and was beginning to believe that somehow he had lost his effectiveness. Well, he had lost his effectiveness, but he really truly thought his best days as a listing agent were behind him. And so what I did to help him is I went through, he'd been a coaching client before. So he was very familiar with all of our unique content and our checklists and our systems and all the rest of it. But I went through, and he, of course, when I asked him, are you following the 7-step listing process? Did you fully pre-qualify the seller? Did you follow the listing, the whole thing? He, of course, said yes, yes, yes. And so then when I went through it, I just asked him all the questions. Did you do this? Did you do this? And then it was like probably 50% of the things, the little tiny micro things that, we teach you guys to do in Premier Coaching, he'd stopped doing. He just wasn't even paying attention. He'd become complacent. He'd become a little maybe arrogant. Certainly entitled, like, oh, don't you know who I am? I've been in the business for so long. I've listed and successfully sold so many houses. So I went through the checklist with him and did a checkup from the neck up. We discovered that there were quite a few things that he wasn't doing. Fortunately for him, there were easy things to change. But fortunately for you, now you're learning from the mistake he made. And so the move do for you is to learn it right the first time and then don't stop doing it once you've got the skill mastered. And that's what really matters. All right, Julie, let's get to point number 1, the top 10 reasons why you didn't get the listing. And I'm going to go with I'll read the title. You assumed, this is the point I was just making, it's funny. You assumed it was yours and you got lazy. Julie, explain.
Yes. Well, there's many flavors of lazy, right? So it could be showing up late, skipping a polished presentation altogether because you just assumed that you were just there to get it signed, failing to pre-qualify. A lot of our points today and tomorrow are about pre-qualification questions. Being sloppy with pricing or rescheduling carelessly, just assuming that they'll put up with that, taking your chances. You should always look sharp, sound confident, and treat every appointment like you are competing and like it's the only shot you've got to get it. Now, I have to point out, because you were talking about your client call yesterday a little bit. Yesterday's podcast was largely about presentation style, stepping away from the doorbell when you ring it, and not fighting over the head of the table, all of those little nuances. Today and tomorrow, we're talking more about pre-qualifying, and don't go if you don't know these things. Call and find out. Use your pre-qualification script. So you assumed it was yours and you got lazy. Well, that relates to point number 2. You didn't know you were competing. Well, that's one of the questions in the pre-qualification script. If you're unaware of other agents in the mix, you're already behind. Use our pre-qual script to uncover the competition. Here's a pro tip. Aim to present last in most cases. It's the closing position. It gives you the final word to seal the deal. They've already talked some objections through with other agents. They probably, hopefully, ruled them out. And now it's time to sign. And I think, Tim, you can probably elaborate on that, because you and I both like to go last most of the time.
Let me give them 2 suggestions. First of all, most agents won't ask if they're competing because they think that somehow the seller is going to be going from, I'm just going to interview Bob. Now Bob asks if I'm interviewing other agents. Maybe I should be interviewing other agents. Like, you think by asking the question, you're seeding the mind of the seller. That's not really true. You have to ask the question the right way. And if I remember correctly, I don't have this memorized like I used to, obviously, but I think the question in our pre-qualification script is, Mr. Seller, generally speaking, when people have me out for the job of selling their home, I'm the only agent that they're speaking with. Is that the case today? Ask the question. I don't think the script, what I just said is not exactly it, but the gist of it is that. So you need to say, listen, it's okay for you not to be interviewing anybody else. But in case, are you interviewing anybody else? That's what you want to know. And why do you want to know that? Because in the next question, our pre-qualification script, will be, that's interesting. How did you choose those other agents to speak with? And then when they tell you that, you're going to know exactly, well, I know this one. This one just got their license because it's my Uncle Charlie. And this one I know from church, and those types of things. Now you know who you're
important. This is important, because what if they say, I'm going with, I don't know what the new version of Help You Sell is, but the discount broker, right?
Right.
We used to call them Help You Smell, Well, maybe it's a discount broker. Maybe it is their best friend from church, in which case you're going to have to be really careful because they have a stronger center of influence than you, perhaps. Maybe you're in a different center of influence.
In other words, the agents that Julie is trying to get you to understand that you need to know who you're interviewing or competing against, because the connection that the other agent that you're competing against might have with the seller is more of a personal one than you maybe have. And it's important to know that, so you can kind of cater your approach. For example, if you find out you're competing against somebody who is their friend or their mom, it doesn't even really matter. You can use this story, and I'll tell you guys a story. And this actually really happened to me, but I'm giving you the story. You guys can change it. I went on a listing appointment. I'll never forget this. It left kind of in retrospect, it's hilarious. But I was sitting at this, kitchen table, and I was listing a house with a lady that was probably in her 70s, could have been in her 80s. I was in my 20s. And, we were going through, we'd done all the presentations. She was already saying, yes, let's get the property sold. She already had another place to go. Everything was squared away. I mean, there's just green lights all the way. And so then we're doing the paperwork, and then she stops and she said, do you know, my neighbor down the way, like 5 houses down, is my friend from high school, and she sells real estate too. And I didn't know who the other agent was, but I stopped myself and I said, and I thought, well, I think this lady might be confused. I'm worried that I might be putting too much pressure on her. So I'm going to back off, and I'm going to ask her, are you, so I just stopped myself. And I said, so are you planning on, Mrs. Schaefer, I don't remember what her name was, but are you planning on listing your house with her? And I just sort of gave her a Scooby-Doo side look. And and this is what the funny part was, is that she was very demure. She was a small lady. And then she got up from her chair. And she had these glasses on, and she takes her glasses down, she puts them on the edge of her nose, and she leans over, gets closer and closer to me. And she looked me square in the eye, and she said this, "Hell no, honey. I want someone I can yell at."
That's right.
But how do you use that going forward? When you're talking with the seller and they're planning or thinking that they should be listing with their center of influence, friend, family, or whatever, not somebody based on their actual skill or their actual past performance, but somebody that they have a feeling of self connection or connection with, that's a script, or that's a story that you can tell where you can help them to understand that maybe listing with someone who you're really close friends with isn't a great idea, because it's not like you're going to be able to hold your brother, accountable like you would let's say, for example, somebody who's just a hired professional. There's other iterations that we teach you in Premier Coaching of that. But another one is like, that I appreciate the fact you're thinking about listing with your brother. Sounds like he could use a break. But here's the thing you got to consider. What if something goes wrong in the transaction? What if there's a problem? What if there's something that happens that you're not happy with, and now you're having Thanksgiving dinner with them in a few months, and that problem is still lingering? He knows there was a problem. You know there was a problem. That's going to create a long-term potential challenge in your relationship, and you might want to consider whether or not that's actually something you want to do. And if they still say yes, then what you could do is you could, and this is not at all the first line of attack on this, you could suggest that you co-list with the other realtor, or even my favorite path for it was just pay the other realtor a referral fee. I'll tell you what, let's just do this. I'll call up your Uncle John, and I'll ask John if he has first bite at the apple. If John has any potential buyers for the house after I get listed, we'll make it so John has essentially advanced access to the property, and any potential buyers then obviously will get early opportunities to purchase it. And that by itself is usually enough for the seller to be happy with that. Okay, well, that's fine. Call John, and you'll be the bearer of bad news.
They were usually relieved to have you do that. They're like, oh, okay,
totally.
Will you do that for me? That would be great.
Yeah. Totally. The next version is going to be where you're going to call up. I want you to, John needs the money, or he's usually the seller's trying to do their friend the favor. And you say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll just give John a referral fee. So a portion of the commission from me selling the house will go to John. Does that make sense? And then the last version, or the last sort of out on that whole thing, is to suggest that you co-list it with John. But, I wouldn't go the co-listing route, because obviously you'll make less money and you'll probably end up doing all the work anyway. Yeah. So these are all just different thoughts for you. But the moral of the story is don't go if you don't know. And it's always important that you know who you're competing against. And again, these are all scripts and techniques that we teach you in Premier Coaching. It's very difficult for me not to want to share them with you guys today, because in the back of my mind, I know there's somebody that's listening who's about to have this exact situation happen to them the second they're done listening to this podcast. And I'm urgently trying to help that person solve a problem before they realize that they have it. All right, Julie, let's go to point number 3.
Okay, point number 3, don't go if you don't know the seller's price expectations. This can create conflict and confusion if you don't at least have some sense of what the seller has in mind before you go. Now, a caveat to this, and Tim, you and I will go over a little bit of scripting, because the seller is going to say, well, that's why I'm having you over, right? When you ask them using the pre-qualification. And
Julie, let's just give them the script. It'll explain what you're about to say better, right?
Sure. Okay.
So yeah. when you're using the pre-qualification script, one of the questions is, Mr. Seller, do you have a sense of what your property is worth in this market? And Julie's right. 50% of the time, they're going to say something kind of like, that's your job. You're going to tell me that, or whatever.
That's why I'm having you over.
Right. And then what you're going to say is, Mr. Seller, I appreciate that. And you're right. That is one of my jobs, when I am helping you put a price on the house. But let me ask you this. Help me choose what comps I should be using, or comparable properties I should be using when assigning a value to the property, or when we're working together to find out what the property is worth. What properties have you seen sell in your neighborhood? Maybe you went to open houses. Maybe you went to a holiday party. What houses have you seen sell in your neighborhood that you hold in the back of your mind as being probably good comparisons to what your property should be used as a comp? Now, I know what they all are. Obviously, I've been through all of them, but I'm wanting to know your opinion, because I haven't been through yours yet. And I will say 90% of the time at that point, the seller will tell you exactly what they think the comps are. So here's what the seller will say. Let's say this is an $800,000 house. The seller is going to say, well, there was the house that sold down the street. But that house had a smaller backyard and didn't have a pool. And that one closed for $775. And they maybe don't know all the specifics, but they're going to know enough to make them dangerous, right? And if you don't think they've been all over Zillow and all these other, done for you pricing apps, you're crazy. Of course they have. And then, I remember that property. Yeah. And then, you're going to write that one down. And then they're going to say, well, and then there was this one, and then there was this one. If you're lucky, they'll give you 3. So based on what you said, Mr. Seller, the first one closed at $775, the second one closed at $800, and the third one closed at $825. So it sounds to me like you think your house is worth somewhere between $775 and $825. Okay, great. I'll write that down, and hopefully I'll show up at your door and give you a surprise that might be worth more, but I appreciate that information. And then move on to the next question in the pre-qualification script. Because what your goal is to find out what they think it's worth. And because finding out what they think it's worth before you go on the appointment, which is again, don't go if you don't know, is one of the most powerful. And remember, we didn't talk about this, but one of the other things is you have to know their motivation. That's actually in our pre-qualifying script, which you get with Premier Coaching, that's like the second or third question. So when this property sells, Mr. Seller, where are you going next? You want to know right away what their motivation is in their time frame. We're moving to Tennessee. Tennessee, wow, that is so beautiful. I'm excited for you. Ideally, how soon do you need to be there? Well, we need to be there within the next 6 months. 6 months, okay, terrific. So what's bringing you to Tennessee? Well, we're just retiring, or we've got a job there, or whatever the answer is. Okay, great. Or let's say, so do you already have a house picked out? And they're going to say, yes, we do, or no, we don't, or we're building something. And then you're going to have even more information that's going to really give you insights as far as what their motivation is. Because let's say, for example, they want to move to Tennessee. They don't have to move to Tennessee. They don't have another property picked out. And there's no real date for them to have the property picked out by, or for them to even have their existing home sold by. You see how that's not as valuable as, say, for example, someone that says, I'm moving to Tennessee because I got a job as a manager in the Volkswagen factory in Chattanooga, and I have to be on the job in 90 days.
And I'm already in contract on a new house.
Exactly. I'm already in contract on a new house, and we're closing in 2 weeks. You guys get the point? So you got to ask these qualification scripts or questions before you go out, because it's going to make it so that once you know what all the answers are to all the questions, there's zero chance you're not going to take that listing. My guy who inspired today's show had stopped asking about 50% of the questions. Somehow he thinks his intuition was going to answer all the questions. And of course they weren't. So he was showing up without knowing whether the seller was interviewing other agents, without knowing what the seller thought the house was worth, without probably knowing the seller's time frame. Julie?
Well, that's the thing. So what we're trying to demonstrate here is knowing the answers to these drilled down questions, which are the result of using your pre-qualification script, even if you have to use it over 2 calls and a follow-up call. You don't have to do all the questions at once, but get them done before you get there. It can greatly change and affect the way that you're going to present, the material you're going to present, your outlook, your approach. I had an emergency call with a client last week who is an excellent broker, takes like 90% of the listings that she goes on. And normally she's the one who is the quote neighborhood agent in the certain neighborhoods that she works heavily. But in this case, she was a fish out of water with a competing neighborhood where somebody else was the neighborhood agent. Now, how you handle those 2 different appointments when you're the neighborhood agent versus when you're competing against one and you're not, those are different scripts. So the approach changes based on what you find out. Just like you were talking about, they want to go to Tennessee. Maybe they've been there twice, but they don't have a job there and they haven't got a property situated. That's totally different than somebody who's closing next week and is about to have double mortgage payments, for example. So that's why we're drilling down like this. Now, I want to just pause here for a second, Tim. When the seller says, and you have used the pre-qual scripts, and that seller says, even though you know that the comps say 800, but the seller in this case, maybe they say 850. Rookie mistake would be some agents are just looking for a reason to cancel the appointment. Oh, the seller's overpriced. The part of the script says, that's interesting. How did you arrive at that price? Because they live in the neighborhood. They might know of private sales. They might know of some probate thing, some house that changed hands, a new construction infill house that just closed that you don't know about. You're not picking it up in the MLS. Sometimes they do have intel that's going to cause it to be a little bit more.
Well,
and
let's add to this.
Yeah,
but Julie, let's add to this, because you're making a really good point, but you're missing like the most important part of this. If they have to sell, if they have a high level of motivation, and at the same time, they basically got unrealistic expectations, or remember, don't ever say lower the price, or don't ever say things like that, or don't ever say my CMA. If they think their property is worth more than what the market is telling them that it's worth, in other words, Mr. Seller, now that I've seen the property, I can understand why this is. If let's say the seller has to sell, they have to move to Tennessee in 90 days. They have a new house to go to. They have all these different pressures that are making it so this is a 100% rock star listing. And they want to price it, let's say it's worth $825. And to Julie's point, they want to price it at $850. And the house is going to sell, and your job now is, and you know what their motivation is. The whole thing is green lights for you if you don't screw it up. So there's a $25,000 price disparity. And here's what you're going to say. Mr. Seller, listen, I appreciate the fact that you feel the house is worth 850, even though the CMA or even though the market is telling us it's worth 825. But now that I've seen the property, I can understand why you think like that and find some attribute that you find, as outstanding in the property. It's got a great backyard. You've done a fantastic job with the kitchen remodel, wherever it is. So I really appreciate the fact that, you have put the extra work into the property and it's in really terrific shape. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and list the price at $849,900. But let's agree that after 2 weeks or 10 showings, whichever comes first, if we don't have a written verified offer on the property, that we'll reposition it on the market to correctly reflect the market's expectations. And then what I want you to do is I want you to get the listing contract signed, put 849 there, and then write the date down when the price is going to be repositioned in the market. Remember, you're not saying lower the price. And so what you're going to say is on this particular date, the price will be reduced or repositioned on the market to 825 in 10 days or 10 showings. And once you have them, so you're giving them what they wanted, an inflated price. And at the same time, frankly, you might be wrong. It could be worth 850. Let's be honest. Mm-hmm. So you don't know. It could be worth 850. They could get an offer on it, closes, no appraisal issues, no whatsoever. So don't be so resolute and egotistical in your pricing, because your pricing could be out of alignment with the fact that the interest rates just went down an eighth of a point. And there was 5 buyers looking in that neighborhood in that price range. And now there's 15, and you're about to walk into what is very much a seller's market. So again, don't get so analytical and drill down on your pricing because you're going to lose more often than you win. And then the seller's going to feel like they got to win. They got their 850. If the house doesn't sell, they've already agreed that they're going to reposition it on the market to correctly reflect the buyer's expectations, in the future. And you're off to the races. And follow our listing plan of action when you take a listing. It's all included in Premier Coaching, telling you exactly what you should do, exactly what you should say for the first. Is that 120 days? When you have the listing, Julie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, so hopefully that's understanding the importance of all this. And hopefully you guys are seeing the importance of taking an organized approach to going on listing appointments. And Julie said this at the start, and it's a really good point. Working with buyers is physical labor. It obviously doesn't require this level of skill. It obviously doesn't require this level of having a system. But this is the wonderful part of focusing on sellers. You're going to have a hell of a lot less competitors. And even if you do have competitors, other agents that are trying to be listing agents, they don't have a system like what we're describing. They don't have Premier Coaching. They don't have the coaching that you've got, our Harris certified coaches, to answer all your questions and help you along the way. On this podcast, there's 0% chance that you have not learned already 2 or 3 things. I'm sure you have. People love it when Julie and I give scripts. I don't like particularly giving the scripts because they're out of sequence. And so I know some of you guys are writing these things down, but you're writing them down, the questions in the wrong order, which is what a script is. But if you want the scripts, the entire 7-step listing process, just simply go to premiercoaching.com and sign up as a coaching client. You've got nothing to risk because there's 30-day free access. And then after that, there's no contracts. You can cancel at any time. So definitely go to Premier Coaching, or you can click the link below and join Premier Coaching that way as well. All right, Julie Harris, point number 4.
Point number 4 has to do with neighborhood expertise. Perhaps you don't have the neighborhood expertise. Authority comes from knowledge. If you can't rattle off the neighborhood's average days on the market, list to sell price ratios, or trends, you may be losing credibility. It's one of the ways that professional agents compete against non-professional agents is they come off, even if they just reviewed all this 2 days ago, they come off as the neighborhood expert, right? That's something the seller is absolutely looking for. And the big danger here is if the seller happens to know some of this stuff more than you do, then you're sunk, right? So here's a secret: preview competing properties and master hyper local stats to own the conversation. Go and preview what is in contract. Those are homes that did sell. How does your subject property stand up against that home? And take notes and share those with your seller. A great script at the time of the listing, especially when you're competing, is, I took all of this afternoon to go ahead and preview your active competition as well as the homes that are pending currently. I'm just curious, did anybody else do that research for you? Because I've got some great notes. If you put your house on the market today, I can tell you exactly how it fits into the mix. Well, that's a very competitive angle, and it gives you confidence to know what you're up against. It really helps your pricing too. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, there's fantastic CMA tools out there, but if you are working with someone who's analytical, who you probably will be 30% of the time or so, and you can then take that very well done CMA and give it to them, but then explain it to them, they're going to love you and list it with you instantly, yes. Just because you're analytical. When Julie and I would go on more expensive listings, and the chances are the seller was, usually a CEO, a doctor, something like that on a more expensive house. And Julie was able to then explain to them the CMA, explain to them absorption, explain to them all the little nuanced differences between one house and the other. And this market that we worked in was a New Albany Country Club. Towards the later stages of our real estate selling career, there were differences between whether it was a white clapboard house or a brick house, whether it was a painted brick house or whether it was a red brick house, whether it was a federal or whether it was, all these different things. And all those little tiny differences would be reflected if you knew how to use the data. And so when we'd go into a CMA, it wasn't, well, here's the value based on square footage, bedrooms and bathrooms. We'd show them the actual drilled down CMA. Much of the information we got from studying the comps in the MLS, because when we went into this particular market, Julie and I were the fish out of the water. Julie and I had no experience selling in an upper end area that wasn't even where we had zero family connections, zero social connections, but we loved the neighborhood and we wanted to sell more expensive real estate. And frankly, we were ready for a challenge. It had been after like 5 or 6 years selling normal price homes. And then we went out to this other market. And within the first probably year, we were the number one listing agents because we did all the things you guys are telling us, or we're telling you guys to do. And the other agents in the marketplace were all working their centers of influence and past clients, and they didn't have the system, and they were pretty much complacent about how they went about treating the sellers. And so we picked up expired listings. We got listings, and the sellers would say to us, they would just straight up say to us, we listed with you guys because you guys got hustle, because you guys are working, because you guys are professionals. They would say all the things we wanted them to think about us. And we weren't doing any branding or marketing or self-promotion in the particular marketplace. We were calling and we were, getting to know them through social things. And then we would get the call out for the expired listing. And Facebook was around, but all the other social platforms weren't around. And so what I'm trying to explain to you is a real brand is not formed from trying to fool people that you're successful just by, forming a bunch of Instagram content. It's actually, especially in the upper ends, the sellers are far more discerning, and they're going to be making their decisions on who they should be working with based on the things that we're telling you guys today on today's podcast. Because that experience that someone's going to have when Julie's explaining the intricate differences in the value of a property, they're going to be so impressed, and they were, that we would then get referrals from other people that were also inclined to favor people that were more professional than just dippity-doos that they played golf with. Hopefully I'm not insulting a dippity-doo, but if I am, you can be a dippity-doo who plays golf all day and have the same higher level of knowledge. We've had coaching clients like that too. So if you can actually combine a higher level of expertise and knowledge, and you get all your leads from playing golf at different golf courses and clubs, great, go you. But don't skip the importance of being a true professional. And point number 5, Julie.
Point number 5, you talked a little bit about inflexibility on pricing, but point number 5 is you are inflexible on commission and or pricing. Stonewalling on commission or price without a game plan makes sellers feel defeated. Phrases like no, any other questions, shut down trust. Sellers don't like that. The secret is this: use unique selling propositions. Those are known as USPs. That is what makes you different. Why should they choose you? Those unique selling propositions come from your pre-listing package. That's your silent salesperson that goes before you. That way, when you arrive, you're not living in fear of all of those objections. There's a very distinct difference in agents who use, for example, the pre-listing package that you get as part of Premier Coaching that you are able to personalize, versus agents that kind of do a cookie cutter thing, or they don't have a presentation. Maybe they have a pre-listing presentation, but it's like everybody else is in their office. It doesn't really say what makes them different. What happens is a lot of agents will, and I remember before we used a pre-listing package, I used to feel this way. If you don't use the silent salesperson that goes before the appointment and handles all of the objections, what happens in that presentation? Even if you've got a really together presentation, the seller is still sellers are sitting there with these questions in the back of their mind. What about commission? What about flexibility? What about staging? What about communication? And they're holding all that in their brain as you try and sit there and communicate with your presentation. And then they throw those objections at the end, and you feel like you're in conflict at the end. And then you end up walking away saying, I'll follow up with you later. Good luck. And you don't take the listing. It creates a lot of stress for the seller and for the agent to sit in wait of the objections. Remember, an objection is an unanswered question in the mind of your prospect. Your job is to answer their question and move on. If you don't do that, then you're going to have all this conflict during the presentation, or worse yet, when you're trying to close for the signature. And that's a disastrous way to end an appointment.
So to emphasize what she said, I can't improve upon it, but I want to really drill down on one particular thing she said. When you join Premier Coaching, the first thing we're going to teach you to do, if you're obviously focused on being a listing agent, is lead generate, and then, lead generate, set the appointment, pre-qualify, and then send the pre-listing pack. Now, the pre-listing pack is, when I want you to think about what she just said, is your silent salesperson. It's supposed to go in there prior to you going on your appointment. And if you're competing, it has to go try to send it before they interview the other agents, by the way. And the pre-listing pack is going to essentially answer all the questions that they were going to ask you. And you're going to essentially make it so the pre-listing pack is going to answer the question, why should you list with Bob? Tell me, what's Bob's commission? What's Bob's marketing plan? What is Bob doing on market, online? What's Bob doing with relocation? What's Bob doing with luxury? What's Bob doing? All the things. What's your communications guarantee? So that's going to be what's answered in the pre-listing pack. That way, when you get to the seller's house, and you're going to confirm prior to going on the appointment that they've received it and read it. But when you get to the seller's house, there's not going to be any questions that are the types of questions that agents hate to have asked of them when they get there, because the pre-listing pack would have already answered all the questions. So going on a listing appointment without pre-qualifying and having all the questions answered and without sending a pre-listing pack is a recipe for disaster, because then the whole environment, the whole situation when you're sitting across from the seller or next to the seller is going to be nothing but stress, because you're worried that they're going to ask some question. You're worried that they're going to ask about commission. You're worried that you're going to, and so that's the reason agents just sit at sellers' houses and try to wear the seller down with talking about their dog and all the things they have in common and fake friend and all the rest of it. Sellers don't want that. They don't want you in their house at all. The pre-listing pack, when you send it and you follow our 7-step listing process, is going to make it so the time you spend at the seller's house is going to be maybe 15 or 20 minutes and you're getting out. That's what they want. They don't want you in there. They want their evening back. They've worked all day.
Yeah. I'll never forget it. One of our most recent coaching clients that joined, he said, I read his email. He said, I'm finally, after listening to the podcast for 2.5 years, going to join Premier Coaching because I found myself at a listing presentation and I kept on looking at my watch. And when it became hour 4 and I was out of things to attempt to talk about with the seller and I didn't know how to get out of their house, I just went to cutting my commission and overpricing it in a desperate attempt to end up with the signature, which I even then didn't get. I clearly need to get the pre-listing package and some scripts down. So we welcome this client with open arms, of course. That's what we do. We're here to help you with that. That is what we do. So don't let that be you. And if that's been you even more than once, why would you risk that going forward? Sometimes agents will mess up one of these first 5 points. And they'll say, well, that was just a fluke, or the other agent was better friends with them. But the second time that it happens, you calculate what you've lost in commission and in time. Our rule is this: you did a CMA, you sent the pre-listing package, you pre-qualified, you did everything, you previewed, you did your CMA. Now it's time to take the listing. Don't let these things slip past you.
So listen, that is today's podcast. We're going to pick up on part 2 tomorrow. So get ready to take notes. And your homework from today's podcast, it is from every podcast, is make sure you join Premier Coaching. Go to premiercoaching.com. In the meantime, thank you for making this and keeping this your number one favorite downloaded and listened to and now viewed on YouTube, real estate coaching and training podcast. So have a fantastic day. We'll talk to you on the show tomorrow.